Everybody, Andrew Cuneo here. Today I was going to do a reaction to the weekly MTG discussion about the change of the standard rotation window from 2 years to 3 years, which is part of a bigger effort to kind of revitalize Paper Standard. So if you don't know already, they do these weekly MTG streams where they talk about various topics in the Magic world. I usually don't pay very much attention to them because it's often parts of Magic that I don't focus on. But today was one where they're talking about the future of Standard, which is something that I pay some attention to. So Blake is the host of Weekly MTG, and the guests he's got on today are Huey and Andrew Brown. I know Blake and Andrew Brown a little bit from my time playing competitive Magic. Huey was a very long time teammate of mine from playing competitive Magic and one of my closest friends in competitive Magic. But since he's gone to work for WotC, he doesn't talk to me about what he does at WotC, so I don't have any special knowledge about this announcement at all. So it's just going to be my reactions as a regular player. So with that, let's get into it and see what they have to say.
I referenced the announcement we made in Minneapolis, but I'm not going to assume everyone was watching that. So, Billy, why don't you just quickly recap what we announced in Minneapolis?
Yeah, so in Minneapolis, we announced that as the first step of what will be a multi-step approach to rejuvenate tabletop standard play, starting this September with Wilds of Eldraine, we will be moving from a 2-year rotation to a 3-year rotation for standard constructed.
All right. So I know so people are putting questions in chat already, which is great. I'm going to start writing them down. We also, for those who don't know, we have an official Magic Discord channel. And last Thursday, we did an activation where Andrew and Billy...
I'm going to stop it there. When he says activation, he means they did a discussion. It's just nonsense marketing term, but that doesn't really have anything to do with the subject matter here. So the important thing from my perspective is Huey just said that, the impetus of this change is really tabletop or paper. Now, I'm basically exclusively an arena player at this point. I'm one of the I think, fairly large number of people that coming out of COVID just decided I'm not going to maintain a paper collection anymore, so I'm not going to try to go to the paper tournaments anymore. I'm really only interested in playing digitally. And so I think it's important to note that this is an attempt by WotC to, appeal to people in my shoes and maybe get us excited to start collecting cards to play Standard in stores again. Personally, I don't think it's going to work for me, but maybe somebody watching this we'll give it a second thought, depending on how things go. So that's, that's kind of interesting. I'm mostly going to be listening to this from the viewpoint of, okay, with what they're changing, how can I expect that to affect things on Arena? And obviously that's not going to be their main focus, but, some of the changes are going to have carryover effects onto Arena.
Came and answered some questions for people, and so we're going to ask some of those questions to kick things off, some of the most popular questions, because we know they're going to be asked. So the first one and the most popular question we've definitely gotten, Andrew, are around bans. So can you tell this, 3 years is definitely a different rotation cadence. How does that change how we approach bans in Standard?
Okay, so the way we're going to approach bans in this new 3-year window is we are only going to have one banning event per year. This is going to take place before the previews start for every single rotation set or fall set. So for example, this year that would be Wilds of Eldraine. So we're going to make majority of all of our changes to all formats in that one window, probably in like the late summer. It's a huge change. Also, after every 3 weeks of every single set release, we are going to open up a mini ban window for us to potentially make changes if we, release something and it has a significant negative effect on a format. So that'll include all formats. But like I said, we will make majority of our changes in that single window in the late summer before previews start for the fall set.
So that doesn't sound very workable to me. I wouldn't be too concerned about it, though, just because this isn't, some sort of crazy suicide pact Wizards is making. If they feel a strong enough need to violate this new ban timing policy, I'm sure they will. So it's really just going to depend on how successful they are at producing balanced cards. If they have a whole bunch of problems, I'm sure we'll see them break this rule, but probably they'll try to adhere to it for as long as possible.
And I'm going to be extremely clear on the smaller ban window 3 weeks after a set comes out. That's going to be extremely rare. I think we're going to only use that for, I'll use an example. Cards like Felidar Guardian, where it's clearly significantly negatively impacting a format. So that is our, nuclear button that we still want to have around just in case things go wrong. But like I said, majority of the changes once per year.
Okay, so unlike the current status quo, which is we kind of ban things when we ban things,
right.
We're going to be more regular with this. We're going to tell people when this is coming so they know and can go prepare.
Correct.
Okay, so what's the reasoning behind this change? Why are we moving to this sort of cadence?
So the largest reason that we've heard from the community is that, we are banning too frequently, too randomly, and it's just kind of hard to maintain your collection and, feel happy to invest in the cards and say, hey, I'm going to go play in Friday Night Magic and I'll have my deck and it'll be fun. So,
I'm not surprised that they're hearing from people that they ban things too frequently in paper Magic. Going back to Eldraine and the Ikoria, there were a lot of big mistakes. It was a historically terrible stretch for Standard, and I'm not surprised that they're hearing from people that they ban stuff too much. I am a little bit dubious that just changing your announced banning practices is going to be enough to convince people to come back, but sure. This is part of a bigger step is to try to have a more easily understood and more predictable banning plan.
So when we were doing things like that way too often, it was really hurting too many players, and we really want to be able to ensure that people can have confidence and know that, this is only going to happen once per year, and I can feel confident in having my deck and playing my deck for a while.
Yeah. Now, let's spend some time on this because I'm seeing a number of comments in chat that are saying something to the effect of, so if there's a problem, it'll take a whole year to address. But that's not what you're saying, right? You're saying that problems can be addressed at these smaller windows.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
So again, I'll use more card examples. Like Oko, Thief of Crowns, Felidar Guardian in my head are the two key examples of a card that, is clearly awful for many formats. We would take action in that window.
See, this isn't actually a good example that he just gave with Oko, Thief of Crowns, because the history with Oko was that it came out. We played what I think was called a Mythic Championship at the time. It was one of the digital tournaments. And it wasn't dominated by Oko decks. It was dominated, I don't even remember what won, but the bigger problem at the time was perceived to be Field of the Dead decks. So even though Oko was just an absurdly overpowered card, they ran a tournament, banned Field of the Dead, and then we had to run a whole nother, I think it was called the Mythic Championship, but really, maybe it was the last thing that was called a Pro Tour before they brought them back. I don't remember. There was an Eldraine Paper Pro Tour where Oko was still legal. And so there had obviously been several weeks after the set had come out. We'd had a tournament, they'd banned Field of the Dead, and then another month went by where Field of the Dead, or where Oko was still legal in Standard, and then they banned it. So the idea that this kind of really short-term window would be enough to address something like Oko, I think just isn't accurate. But they make the rules, so if they hopefully they'll never print another Oko. But if they do, they can just change the rules to ban it when they want to or need to. But I wouldn't really. He's making a big point about how that you can have a ton of faith in this timing stuff, and it's going to take years and years of them developing a new track record of really sticking to this before I think anyone should believe it, sadly.
We definitely want to be able to leave ourselves that opportunity to be flexible just in case something like that happens.
Right. Okay. So it's not that we can't fix something outside that year ban. It's just that we're going to do the majority of our changes at that year mark. Okay. Now, that said, we just instituted this philosophy. Are we going to see any bans or any action before then? Before what would be Wilds of Eldraine?
Right. So yes, at the end of this month, I believe, Blake, the date's 5/29. Is that correct?
Yep. Memorial Day.
Yep. We will release a update for the standard format. There will not include any other changes to other formats. We are going to have our new normal yearly cadence update right before the spoilers of Wilds of Eldraine start, and we will focus on older formats there.
Okay. So this is sort of a special, we're taking steps right now.
See, this is, to me, one of the things that they get wrong that has led to Standard losing a lot of popularity. Everybody who watched the last Pro Tour knows that they need to do something to address Fable the Mirror Breaker or Blood Tithe Harvester. It's just like, it's very obvious there needs to be a banning. And we've been basically just sitting here with a standard that's obviously in need of attention, and we're just waiting weeks and weeks. It's going to be close to like a month of just waiting for what is an obviously needed update to the ban list. They don't take action fast enough. And remember, this should have been the time period where everyone is excited to be trying out the new March of the Machines cards, because they've gone back to the cadence where there was a Pro Tour shortly after the release of March of the Machines, which ideally would have been where we would have gotten to see a bunch of exciting new strategies with the new cards, and then we could take inspiration from the Pro Tour and go try those out, or just try out other things you're interested in. But you can't do any of that right now because Standard is so obviously in need of a ban. It's like, I don't really understand why they think it's appropriate to be waiting close to a month to address something that they're all but saying that they're going to ban something on May 29th. I don't really get why we're waiting.
Billy, we've heard a lot of questions about play programs as kind of the next step on that. I know we don't have anything to announce, but what are you and the team thinking? What are you working on in that space?
Yeah, so I think to really rejuvenate tabletop Standard play, there needs to be regular ways for people to interact with the format. Ways including participating in play events at their local store, or participating in maybe larger standalone events. Those are the two axes we are mostly focused on. And like Blake said, I don't have detail to share today, but sooner rather than later, there'll be more to announce in that regard.
Mm-hmm. So we get a lot of questions. Again, you're just ideating at this point, so please no one take anything we're about to say as gospel. But we get a lot of questions about, can you do a new series in the store? Can you do Grand Prix style events again? Is kind of everything on the table, or do you have a certain direction in mind?
Yeah, I think we're definitely at a point where we are looking at things with the top line view. Every type of thing is on the table. I don't think it would be quite as specific as, hey, we're going to have a big standard Grand Prix series. Like, we're not at that sort of level of granularity, but those types of events are certainly on the table. Standard play programs in the store, what those will look like, those are the kind of things we're discussing. I hope that answers the question.
Well, I don't know how much that really... It doesn't illuminate very much, Kiwi. A little bit of kind of backstory or / history of this is I don't know that people understand really that before the esports era, WotC was doing a lot financially to prop up having a competitive play system in paper. I mean, it was like a marketing expense for them. So, they were subsidizing the cost of the Grand Prix. They were doing stuff to help out the local stores to make sure that it was financially profitable for them to be doing, F&M kind of stuff. And when they switched to the esports model, they explicitly pulled back from doing a lot of that stuff. They stopped doing the coverage at the Grand Prix, which was a big part of what made the Grand Prix so popular. And then we obviously also had COVID, which really, paused everything. So whether or not this is going to be successful, I think is going to really depend a lot on how much money Wizards is going to invest into making it successful. And I don't know if they're ever going to give us a straight answer on that. Certainly, it seems like they're not really ready to make an announcement about it today. So it's going to be like a wait and see kind of thing. If they told me, if it happens that they announce that there's going to be effectively a standard Grand Prix series, I would say that's great. That might be enough to get people excited to try standard again. I think the reality, though, is that so much damage has been done to the competitive ecosystem that just even restoring the amount of support that they used to do in the past probably isn't going to be enough to get things going again. They probably need to go even beyond that. And I'll be surprised if that's what they wind up doing, but we'll have to wait and see.
What was the consideration for going to a 3-year rotation versus a smaller rotation? You mentioned that players get frustrated with random bans, which I fully understand, but I've always felt that the biggest problem with standard was that it gets stale as the format gets long in the tooth. Was there any consideration for something like one set in, one set out, perpetually rotating standard so that the format is considered healthy and refreshed with each release?
We definitely discussed that. We did try this back in, I believe, the Amonkhet time period, right, Blake?
It was in that time period, yeah.
Right, and that was unsuccessful. Many people cited that there were too many cards leaving and it was too hard to keep up with. Kind of going back to the Aaron Forsyth released an article about, kind of why we're doing this. One of the main reasons for us making this change is that we want to kind of raise standard up from all angles, right? We want to make sure that obviously it's good at the top level, but also we really care about it at the store level. Mm-hmm. And those are the people who, can't really keep up with all of these, quick turn rotations. I'm going to change my, sideboard by 5 cards every single weekend. We want to ensure that everybody can have a good time and just be like, hey, I'm going to take the same deck to F&M, 5 or so times and still be able to have a good time. And we believe that with this set of changes, we are allowing that player to do that.
Yeah. Well, and we know that that's one of the things players like a lot about Pioneer and Modern is they
Right.
can, especially at a local level where you don't have to constantly be on top of the metagame, and you can just bring your deck and go play each week.
Right. Moving into that point a little bit more, one of the things we're going to try and do a little bit more in design is have more decks with a clear identity. I think for a long time, Standard's been color, mid-range or whatever, mm-hmm. right? And we definitely want to move away from that. We see with, popular formats like Pioneer, Modern, and Commander, there's a strong identity with your deck. So we definitely want, we're moving towards more decks and cards that can work together that feel like they have a cohesive identity. Something that we kind of lost when we moved away from the block structure.
I think that's an interesting idea, and I think that it would be great if they could achieve that. I kind of wonder if it's actually attainable given their current approach to designing cards. Because when you try to play a more synergy-based deck in Standard right now, you pretty quickly run into this problem that you can have like 2 or 3 of your cards out and they're working together, and they still aren't as good as Shieldred, or they still aren't as good as Atraxa. So, like, is there really enough room in boosting the power level of the synergy-based cards to make them better than just the standard all-star type cards? I guess obviously there is if you make the cards cheap enough, but I think the thing that's different with the older formats is that they're faster, so you just have to play more cheap cards. So like if you look at a modern like Hardened Scales deck, which is a very heavy synergy deck, it's just everything is so cheap that the synergies can actually compete with like just the very high power level cards at 3 and 4 mana. And I mean, maybe they'll start doing that in Standard, but I'd be a little bit surprised because it really, they need to either make the 3 and 4 mana and like the 7 mana standalone cards weaker, or they need to make the synergy stuff just cheaper, which, I mean, I suppose they could do, but I think it's kind of a hard thing to do for them if you're trying to design standard sets where you just, in order for things to be playable, you just have to print a ton of 1 and 2 mana stuff. I think it crowds out a lot of the design space that they might want to use. So this sounds like an appealing possibility that Andrew Brown's describing, but I'm not sure how attainable it really is.
But that's much more on the forefront of our mind while we're actually making the cards, so you can definitely expect that a lot more in the coming years.
Okay. Is Alchemy also going to balance cards that could be banned at the end of the month like previous bannings? So part of this rotation change also further separate. It's worth noting, we haven't said it here, but we did say it in the announcement. Alchemy will continue on a 2-year rotation, and Standard will be on a 3-year rotation. So that will further differentiate the Alchemy and Standard formats. And my understanding from the Arena team is that they are going to do what's best for the Alchemy format. And if that involves rebalancing cards that are going to be banned in Standard, then they will do that, much like they did with Meat Hook Massacre, for example. But it doesn't necessarily mean they have to do that. Andrew, anything to add to that?
Not really. I've had many conversations with them, and they're still evolving their philosophy around what they want to do there. But like Blake said, they're going to prioritize the Alchemy players. So I guess everybody will just have to wait and see.
This is a kind of a funny question to me, just because they're kind of answering it as though we're supposed to just believe that they've been, just supporting Alchemy as we've been going along. And this is coming from someone who was excited about Alchemy, wants Alchemy to succeed, but like they very obviously have just stopped trying with it. When was the last time they even rebalanced a card that was in Standard? I think it's been, months and months and months. Well, maybe that's not true. Maybe they did some more of those like ones where they just try to buff draft commons and make them a tiny bit better, that just doesn't work in terms of making the format exciting. So I guess my reaction to this is, first of all, it would be exciting for me if they start actually trying to rebalance cards in Alchemy, because to me, the part of Alchemy that was exciting was the potential that there would be rebalancing of the cards that were at the top end to make it so that, the best decks would get shaken up at the top of Standard or Alchemy or whatever, so that there would be a point to continuing to work on new decks, as the format went along, so we weren't just waiting for the release of more cards to shake things up. They just flat out have not done that in a very long time in Alchemy. Crucius has existed in its printed form for how many months, and that card is so incredibly overpowered, and they haven't nerfed it. Fable has obviously been begging for a nerf for probably close to a year at this point, and they haven't nerfed that. So I don't really know what they think they've been doing in Alchemy. From my perspective, I would like to play Alchemy, but there are two things that are holding me back from doing it and from making content on it. One is that they just don't actually, I don't think they've lived up to the idea that they were actually, rebalancing the cards and maintaining a format where there are balance changes to keep it refreshed and exciting to play. I just flat out don't think they've done that. The other thing is that it's just, it also just hasn't been a popular format with the community, especially with people who want to play more competitively. I would like to be able to make competitive Alchemy videos, but if you play Alchemy on the ladder, probably half to 2/3 of your matches, you play against someone who just does not have a competitive deck. It's not fun for me to do. It doesn't lead to making good content. So it's just really Alchemy is not close to being what they're sort of trying to pretend like it is in this video. That said, it does sound like Alchemy is going to have more of an identity that's separate from Standard with this change. So, maybe that's a reason to think that Alchemy is going to start seeing some growth and, start seeing some improvements. It would be nice. I'm certainly willing to give it a second try, but it's going to take more than just separating the rotation window from Standard. It's going to take that. They're going to have to actually start rebalancing the cards again.
I've had a couple questions about why waiting until the 29th. Very simple answer for that. Arena Championship 3 is the weekend of the 27th and 28th and is Standard. So the 29th is the first day we'd want to do anything. People have already been preparing for the Arena Championship 3. It's a really big event. It's a big deal to the players who are competing, and we didn't want to mess with their testing, with their play experience. So we're doing it literally the first day after that event and talking about it then. So that's why the 29th. I understand people want to know about, these things sooner.
As somebody who's played in a lot of competitive events, I got to say that I really dislike Blake's answer here. As a competitive player, having 2 weeks notice for what the changes are going to be, I think it's enough. And I also think it's just really, it almost feels like they're sabotaging any excitement that might happen with Arena Championships 3, because they're going to be playing a stale Standard format, a format that everyone knows needs a banning, and everyone knows also that there's going to be a banning on the 29th. You're not going to see any exciting new decks. You're not even going to see any decks that you might want to try, because they're all going to be decks that are probably either going to be playing a card that's about to be banned, or they're going to be decks that were specifically built to play against decks that were playing the cards that are about to be banned. And it's bad for the viewers, but I also think it's bad for the players in the sense that if you're a player participating in the competitive events, you want them to be successful events that people want to watch. It makes WotC more likely to put on more big events in the future. It makes people more interested in, the players that come up with the decks, whether they're content creators or they want to do Magic coaching, or they just want to somehow get their name out there as somebody who came up with an exciting new deck. And when they run these events with stale formats, none of that happens. they're just producing an event that people are not going to be very excited to watch, and people aren't going to be very excited to play the decks. It's so much better for the players to actually get to compete in a fresh event. It's really, I think it's doing a huge disservice to the people who might watch the event, and also just doing a disservice to the players.
But we're very, especially, Andrew, maybe you can talk about this. We consider competitive integrity a lot when we talk about the timing of these things.
Yeah, definitely. I'd also want to mention that in the time period after the Pro Tour and before the Arena Championships, Aftermath Epilogue, whatever it's called, Aftermath has
Epilogue
come out.
was the internal, yeah.
I get
the Aftermath,
confused.
yep.
Has released and is in the standard format, and we've already seen certain decks show up and, kind of defy expectations. So I'm really excited to see what happens there.
That is a fair point. I mean, they did print some new cards. The new cards don't seem to be very good. I would not expect them to show up very much, but maybe I'll be wrong.
Yeah. And Billy, you were obviously a player for a really long time. How disruptive would a change to Standard be to someone's testing for Arena Championship 3 right now?
I mean, if I were playing in a big tournament and you and Andrew and whomever got on Twitch and said, yeah, we're going to do a big announcement like smack dab through your testing, I would just be some combination of extremely frustrated, angry, and just not test till after that happens. So about as disruptive as anything could be.
All right.
Obviously, I disagree with Huey there. I think they certainly had enough time to do a banning after the last Pro Tour that would not have adversely affected people's testing. And also, I just want to say, I think that constructed Magic is at its best when it's fundamentally about deck building and not just about tight technical play. And I think they just run too many of these events where it's really not going to be about deck building for the event. Because you might come up with some very slightly better new idea, but that effect is just dwarfed by the fact that people can just copy lists from the last Pro Tour. They're going to have if they just copy the best performing red-black deck, they're just going to have a great deck. And you cannot beat that in a meaningful way by trying to build a new deck or trying to come up with some new tech. It just isn't. It takes the focus of competitive Magic out of what I think is interesting to most people about Magic, which is deck building, and it just puts it on tight technical play stuff like who's making the best mulligan decisions, or who's better at deciding how to sequence their 3 and 4 drops. And that stuff is interesting to an extent, but the coverage doesn't even. It's very hard for the coverage to explain that stuff to people in a way that they're even getting any value out of it, because obviously the commentators are probably not able to really explain the decisions that the high level players are making. So it just leads to you're just watching a bunch of sameness. Two Rakdos decks are meeting and one person wins. Wait, was there anything that that either player did that affected any of the outcome, or was it just all random chance? Who knows? It's so much better when you get to watch an event where it's somebody has come up with a new deck you haven't seen before, and they're playing it against, maybe it's an expected deck, maybe it's another new deck, and you get to see how do these two new strategies face off against each other. And I just think that this Arena Championship, they're going to get none of that, because it's just going to be a bunch of Rakdos decks again. I mean, maybe it'll be like some of the 5-color domain decks. You're going to see basically the same mix you saw at the most recent Pro Tour. So it's just kind of a wasted event in my mind.
I'm going to read this question. It's a little bit trolly, but there is a nugget of truth to it that I think is worth talking about. How long until you go back on this decision? So, this could be a reference to when we shorten standard rotation and then back that off. Could be reference to other things, but look, the reality is that we are constantly taking in data and feedback and working to do what is best for the format and for the players. And sometimes we get new data in. So let's use the 18-month rotation as an example. So when we did that, we were trying to do something sort of similar in speeding up standard so that it felt constantly fresh and constantly new. And when we implemented that, we found out that while we received that feedback that that was what players wanted, their actual actions after we implemented it did not match that desire. So people stopped playing standard, they fell off. For that reason, that helped inform this decision, going to 3 years, because we learned during that period of time that players didn't want their cards to rotate off that fast, and they did want to play with things with some consistency. So this is, again, one piece of the puzzle. We do change our minds sometimes, and I think that that's actually a strength rather than a weakness, because we're willing to admit when something doesn't work, or when we find a better way. So I don't mind the question.
I found that to be kind of a funny question for Blake to answer. I would say a few things in response to that. First of all, I do think that Wizards makes a pretty big mistake of they kind of solicit feedback and then they try to do a data-driven decision-making process. But I don't think that they don't seem to take into account enough that the feedback they've solicited may not actually be accurate. It's not surprising to me that, they ask people some opinion on something and then what people actually did is different. Like, I think they would be better off just making this, just having people who are familiar with Magic making decisions, not based on surveys that they're giving people. The other thing I would say about that is that Wizards does change their minds a lot, especially I lived through a whole series of changes on how they were approaching competitive play. And I think a mistake that they consistently make is they don't make the change quickly enough. So they don't. They leave things in limbo. Like, we're in a limbo period right now where they've told us that we're going to be switching to this new standard banning system, but there's no reason to play standard right now because, well, I mean, if it's fun, you can play it, but it's not fun right now to me because it's just so obviously dominated by Rakdos. And so we're just sort of sitting here waiting for them to do this banning. And kind of similarly, honestly, with this change, when we hit the Eldraine release, rather than having the rotation that we were expecting, we're going to have them go from an 8th set to a 9th set. I think that happens with Eldraine. It might happen the set afterwards. But so we're going to be in uncharted territory where we go from 8 sets up to 9 sets. And frankly, who knows what happens? I mean, who knows if they're actually happy with that? Like, we're going to spend a year building up to this to get to 3 years worth of stuff in standard. And maybe it's successful, maybe it's not. Maybe they have new people making decisions a year from now, and maybe they change course again. Like, that, it's understandable because Wizards is a big company that it takes them a while to change course, but I don't know that they really fully appreciate how often it creates these situations where it's like you've told people that you're going to try to get to something good, and so everyone's just kind of waiting for, okay, are we finally going to get to the point where it's going to be good like you promised? We've been waiting a year to get to this point where we've got 3 years worth of stuff in standard, kind of. So I think it's actually a fair question, and even though it was phrased kind of trolly, I'm glad that Blake responded to it. I don't know that I really agree with his answer, but it is certainly a concern that should be on their radar, that they do have a reputation for, they constantly make these changes. And honestly, they make the changes before it even really feels like they had much of a chance to see how it turned out. Like the 18-month Amonkhet rotation, they did not stick with that for very long. Like they did not give people much of a chance to adapt to it. I mean, maybe it was so disastrous that they were like, yeah, this is awful, we just need to give up on it right away. But that was not my impression. It just, they both change their minds fairly frequently, but they don't execute the changes very quickly, which leads to this state we've been in for years where you don't really feel confident that anything is, going to stay the way you're expecting it to, but you also don't feel confident that it's going to get to the new point. So I guess if they're giving me, reasonable odds on will they change their mind within a year about this, I'd be willing to bet on yes, they will change their mind.
All right, I'll ask. I don't have an answer for this, but I'll ask it because it's from Fire Shoes, and we will answer whatever Fire Shoes wants. When do previews for WoW start? I don't remember off the top of my head. I want to say August 15th. I might be making that up. So don't take that as gospel, but I feel like that is... I feel like that's the right space, but I could...
I don't know the answer to this, but, shout out to Fire Shoes. Definitely one of the best Magic Twitter follows.
Question for Andrew. How do you feel about the top deck in both Pioneer and Standard being so similar? So Rakdos mid-range essentially in both formats is one of the top decks.
I mean, clearly not the best. Like, obviously, when you move to different formats, you want to have a different play experience. That's what one of the general strengths of Magic is, that there are so many different ways to play it. So to your answer, I think it's just flatly no. We want to be able to have people change formats, have a totally different experience, right? So I guess easy answer. There you go.
I'm surprised that Andrew Brown gave that answer, because I would have thought he would have brought up the fact that Rakdos mid-range isn't clearly the best deck in Pioneer. Like the Indomitable Creativity decks won the last PT. Its Indomitable Creativity certainly has a claim to being the top deck in Pioneer. There's also, Lotus Field decks. There's maybe not quite at the top tier, but there are, blue-white control decks with Teferi. So I actually think it's maybe a good thing that there is a deck that you can take from Standard and, go and play it in Pioneer, and it's fairly competitive, but you also, you have a whole different field of opposition. And also you just, the Rakdos mid-range deck is a much smaller share of the metagame in Pioneer than it is in Standard. So to me, this isn't a problem. I mean, honestly, if anything, it might actually be a good thing.
Do you think increasing the power of interaction, especially counterspells, could help make Standard more popular again when interaction was the focus versus threats?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. To answer the exact question, we have been examining our counterspells over the past couple years, and they've been a little lackluster. I think a lot of weight is put on negate. That's a rhyme.
This is very interesting to me that they've been thinking about this, because I do think there's a huge problem with Standard that so many of the kind of counters that are supposed to be a little bit interesting to try in Standard are 3 mana, and you just cannot play 3 mana counter spells with Fable the Mirror Breaker being the best card, because it's too punishing whenever you're on the draw and you don't get to counter their 3-drop because you had a 3 mana counter and you don't have 3 mana at the end of your second turn. Also, I am really not a fan of how much they rely on negate. I just flat out think it's boring that negate is always legal in Standard, and that there's never really an attempt to make something that you would put in your deck over negate really. Like it seems like there's just this. It could be a space where they could be exploring different interesting things, but they just don't. They just keep reprinting negate. Like if you look in Alchemy, there's Bind to Secrecy, which is that's an interesting card. It's not even clear to me that it's better than negate. It depends a lot on your mana base, but at least it leads to you thinking about when you construct your deck. How much do I care about the fact that this is harder to cast versus that it's got some upside over negate? And the same thing happened when they printed Dovin's Veto, although that was years and years ago at this point. Like, I think that just consistently having negate and duress in the format, I think they made a decision to do that a long time ago because they felt that those were just kind of safety valves that if something really got out of hand, the players could just rely on negate or duress. You know, as long as it's not a creature, we're going to have some answers that everybody is always going to have access to some of them. But I do think that it makes Standard just less fun if you always have the same solution to this potential problem. So I really hope that they get away from that and that they either... I guess ideally to me, they would tone down the power level of Standard so that 3-mana counters were more playable again. But if they're not going to do that, then hopefully they at least try to make some better 2-mana counters.
And we are looking to improve, a lot of that kind of interaction in the future. I think in the next year, you'll definitely see a increase on that front. But in general, right now, interaction is kind of at a strong point. When we see kind of the cut down plus go for the throat squeeze, it's difficult to figure out which creatures to play. So it ends up being you want to play more creatures that have immediate value that aren't, totally blanked or, you don't get that much if they're removed immediately. Those are cards like obviously Fable of the Mirror Breaker and, kind of Blood Tithe Harvester gives you blood, Reckoner Bankbuster can be a creature and then gives you cards as well. So we definitely want to move towards a place where, playing a creature and untapping with it is a strong thing to do. So that also dovetails in with the interaction point conversely, but, it's a really delicate balance. It's a hard thing to predict. So I guess that's not really an answer. It's more just kind of a wait and see and just know that we constantly think about that all the time.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree that the interaction is too good right now. I do... Cut Down is a really, really good card. I think the problem is more that there aren't enough equivalent options in other colors or for, other strategies, at least at 1 mana. I made this point a while ago on Twitter that when you're building a Standard deck, when you're trying to come up with a new idea for a Standard deck, if you go through all the cards you're interested in playing in your new idea and you don't have any 1 mana spells, you don't have a viable deck. You have to put 1 mana cards in your deck to be competitive in Standard. And if your strategy does not have any 1 mana cards that are appropriate for it, then you just don't have a viable deck. And so Cut Down winds up getting played a lot, even though nobody puts 4 Cut Downs in their main deck. So it's a little bit hard for me to really see that as this giant boogeyman. I mean, most people don't even have 4 Cut Downs in their 75. But the thing that Cut Down does offer, and Black offers more broadly because of Cut Down and Duress, is you have a 1 mana card that you can play basically in any Black deck. So it doesn't really depend on the strategy that much. But if you look at, say a white deck, Lay Down Arms is a reasonable 1 mana option. Skrelv is a reasonable 1 mana option. Well, I don't really want to admit that because I'm a Skrelv hater, but I guess it's proven to be a somewhat reasonable 1 mana option. Anyway, those are both cards that you can't just put those in any white decks. Like Lay Down Arms, you need a very specific mana base. Skrelv, you need to have a deck where you're playing creatures that are worth protecting. So it's constraining in that sense. Like blue and green, I would say you basically just don't have any options at 1 mana. So if you're interested in building a blue or a green deck, you can maybe look to pair it with like a black deck, so you can play cut down and get access to 1 mana card there. But then, maybe that doesn't allow you to, develop the strategy we're trying to develop. So I think that the problem is not that the interaction is too strong. I just think that the problem is that they pushed the standard cards at 3 and 4 mana to such a high power level that if you want to have a chance to break serve when you're on the draw, you just have to have 1 mana cards that are relevant, that in some way affect the game. If you're on the draw and, you can't just play the whole game behind a play because you didn't do anything until turn 2. And there just aren't enough strategies that have access to cards like that. And that's why you see so much cut down. And, just black decks in general.
With the extra year for standard cards and with the team usually working a year behind, can we expect micro sets of cards updating mechanics like Toxic and Knights a year from now to give them juice if needed to make them viable? So maybe you talked a little bit about this on the announcement, but maybe you can expand on your process and building cards into standard.
Right. So it's doubtful that we'll re-release a mechanic into 3-year standard. Let's say there's a mechanic in the final year of standard and in the newest year of standard. It's unlikely that we'll re-release a mechanic there to kind of enhance that deck. One thing that you can expect us to do is to specifically design cards for those decks in their final year to maybe prop them up if they've lost something. So like a good example probably would be like maybe when a specific protection spell rotates out from the Toxic deck, it would be, that's something that we would look at and be like, hey, do we want to re-add something there to kind of fill that hole because we do think it'll be too weak without it. So that's more of the line you can expect from us in terms of kind of looking backwards at cards. And it is going to be a lot easier for us because with a 3-year rotation, we'll actually be able to see a year worth of cards actively in the environment. So we'll actually have a lot more precision and we'll actually know what cards we actually have to design against, because previously in the 2-year standard window, we would design the entire format without ever seeing any of the cards actually out in the wild. So this actually also makes it easier for us, and I think overall we'll be able to get a better format from it.
I think that's a really good point that Andrew Brown just made, and I think it is a reason to maybe be optimistic about this change in a way that I haven't been so far. That if it really means they're going to be able to do a better job of making a standard that has a variety of competitive and interesting strategies because they get this extra year's worth of knowledge as they're just designing the cards, that could be a very good thing. And that is certainly a reason to be positive about this. So hopefully it plays out that way, because I do feel that one of the things that WotC hasn't kind of explicitly addressed with this effort is that some of the problem has just been that not that great of standard design. Because I think they did sort of explicitly address that, the fire design that happened around Eldraine, that was bad, and that they moved away from that. And I think it's gotten better since then, but I still think that if you look at the standard that we have right now compared to the standard that happened around War of the Spark, or, the standard that happened around Khans of Tarkir, the standard we have right now is not nearly as bad as it was in Eldraine, but it also is a below average quality standard, I would say. So if this is a change that can lead to them, having just a better standard experience, that's I think going to be good for everyone. So hopefully that is going to be the case, and we'll have to wait and see. With that, I think that I'm going to leave it there. This is basically the end of their stream. I'm going to include a link in the description that is to the VOD of the stream without any of my commentary. I have edited out a decent amount of stuff just to, try to make this video not incredibly long. It was the stuff that I really didn't think I had anything interesting to say. If you go and you watch it, you are going to get to hear a lot more of Huey talking about some of the kind of ideas that they're exploring for how to improve the tabletop play programs. Like I said at the beginning, that's not something I'm particularly interested in, so I didn't really have much to say on that. But with that, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.